done like specialized youth ministry, young people's ministry, I should say, for quite some time. Now I'm like out of practice now, but you know, young people kind of encapsulates like 6th grade to, in the United Methodist Church, to 35. The definition of young adult is 35, which is crazy. I just graduated out of young adulthood. And oddly, we like throw them all together in the same demographic, like, oh, those are the young people. Like, we're gonna mix the 6th graders with the 35-year-olds, right, and call it a day, right? Now, obviously there are key differences between them. And, you know, when we break it down by middle schoolers, high schoolers, college students, and then young adults, we see that there's a lot of nuance there. And the reason why we need this nuance for these ages is that there's such rapid growth and developmental, emotional, intellectual growth that happens in young people. I want you to think about the last decade of your life. Like, what was that last decade like? How much change happened in the last decade? And then I want you to remember that a 6th grader who was 11, and the decade from 11 to 21 is quite a lot of change, right? They are likely to go through puberty. They're going to learn, they're going to go from having to learn like basic rudimentary algebra all the way, if they go into a math-heavy career, that they're going to have to learn complex calculus by the end of that. They might experience with alcohol or drugs. You're expected to know and to choose your career path in that amount of time, what you want to do for the rest of your life, what you want to study, and you have to commit to it by enrolling in college. And you have to do all of this before you're legally allowed to buy alcohol. And so there are times of immense growth in your lives that we go through. Think about the 4 years that you spent in high school or in college. Like, how different were you when you started versus when you left? How much growth happened? Compare that to the last 4 years of your adulthood life. How much growth happened? Probably not the same amount of rapid growth. And that's part of what it means to be a young person, is that they go through these periods of immense growth, and we expect them to do it. This is similar to the immense growth that the disciples were supposed to have had when they followed Jesus. Their time together was short, probably about 2 to 3 years in the time that they followed Jesus, but their growth was supposed to be exponential. After encountering the resurrected Christ, after witnessing his death and resurrection, they weren't simply supposed to go back and have shown zero growth. Like graduating from college, everything was supposed to be different for them. If your belief in God was suddenly taken away, just completely taken out of your life, just like, I don't know, plucked out of your life, besides going to church and knowing the people that you know from church, would your life be any different? When we encounter and know God in our lives, the purpose of that is that we are never the same again. That it's a new beginning in our lives, that we have begun the process of being transformed. Just like when a caterpillar goes into a cocoon, we don't expect that the caterpillar comes back out as a caterpillar. We expect that it comes out as a butterfly. The same is with our lives and knowing God's love, that we can expect to emerge changed. Encountering God changes us, and so we should expect that we have gone through a life-changing experience. You can choose whatever metaphor works for you, whether that's going to college, going to high school, a caterpillar. The end result is the same. The expectation is change. It might not be rapid, and it could be gradual, but the difference should ultimately be there. And so today we're starting kind of a new sermon series as people in the summer go camping. And I used to go camping every year during the summer around this time, and I was thinking about camping. And so today we're camping with Jesus. We're joining him today around the campfire. And so this sermon series is very straightforward. We're going to look at different Jesus stories where he does something that people would do when camping. And so today is a campfire with his disciples. And so your text comes from John 21, 1 through 19. I invite you to follow along. The words will be on the screen, but it's also in your bulletins. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he showed himself in this way. Gathered there together were Simon Peter, heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the sea. But the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from land, only about 100 yards off. When they had gone ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there, with fish on it and bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you have just caught." So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore, full of large fish, 153 of them. And though there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Now none of the disciples dared to ask him, "Who are you?" because they knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time that Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my lambs." A second time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep." He said to him a third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter felt hurt because he said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you used to fasten your own belt and go wherever you wished. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go." He said this to indicate the kind of death by which he would glorify God. And this he said to him, "Follow me." The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
So the story is from the Gospel of John. This is John's very last story. It's actually sort of like an epilogue. It's to answer the question, and it's dedicated to the disciples, but it's to answer the question, like, what happened to Peter is basically the question that it's asking. What happened to Peter? It's like saying, I know what happened to Jesus, and there is this other pretty important character, not the important character, not the main character, but this other guy, Peter. What happened to that guy? And so they've all experienced and seen the resurrected Christ a few times. They've touched his hands, right? They've had that story with Thomas where Thomas wants to touch Jesus' hands and his side to feel where he was pierced. And so they've also followed Jesus for like the last 2 or 3 years. They've gone through this immense period of growth. Yet they go back to old patterns. Peter decides he's going fishing. He's not going for leisure like I would, and say, we're going to Mammoth to go on our annual fishing trip with the boys, or whatever people do when they go fishing. But he's returning to his old profession, his old line of work, along with other disciples like the sons of Zebedee, who are also fishermen. And so they have this miracle of fish, and they know that it's Jesus. And they sit down around a campfire with him. And they share this campfire meal. I don't know if you've ever had campfire meals, but everything tastes better when it is cooked around a campfire. And so they're mesmerized by the flickering fire, of how food just simply tastes better because it's slightly burnt and it's cooked, right? And that's the backdrop for this conversation that Jesus has with Peter. Jesus asks Peter, "Do you love me?" And after he says yes, Jesus responds with, "Feed my sheep," or "Tend my sheep." This is not an accident. This is hearkening back to John's themes in John's gospel about how Jesus is the good shepherd. When Jesus declares that I am the good shepherd, because he's empowering Peter to be a shepherd too. The 3 times are not an accident as well. It's symbolic that it is undoing the 3 times that Peter denied Christ, that Peter denied knowing Jesus. Jesus asks Peter 3 times if he loves him. The last time that Peter was the focus in John's gospel, the last time that we picked up the story of Peter was focused on Peter denying Jesus 3 times before Jesus And sometimes God needs to remind us that everything is supposed to be different in our lives, that we have encountered the resurrected Christ, and because of that, we are now supposed to be following him. We may have moments of doubt or uncertainty, but ultimately our purpose is to follow Jesus. This campfire scene that we find ourselves privy to is an intimate moment between Jesus and Peter. In a gentle correction, Peter knows the mission before him. That same mission is before us, to feed and tend Jesus' sheep, to care for God's people in all aspects of their life. Every Easter, when we come to Easter and we celebrate the resurrected Christ, when we go and stare at the empty tomb and know that the Lord is risen, we remember that he is risen indeed. But do we remember what happens after that? That the life we live following him is a life that is changed. That we do not go back to our lives in the same manner as they were before, because we have seen the resurrected Lord. Instead, that life sends us into the world to feed Jesus' sheep, not metaphorically, but to feed those who are hungry and to tend to those who are in need. The changed life that we live means caring for others in the same way that Jesus cared for others. And that is what Jesus is empowering Peter to go and do. Because Peter wasn't sure what to do now. He wasn't sure what to do. So he fell into old habits and old patterns. And so Jesus came to give him some direction. If you are in a position of wondering what direction to take, first know that going back to business as usual is not the right direction. That is not what Jesus asks for us. The second step is that the direction will always be towards God's people, towards the lost sheep, towards the hungry sheep, towards the sheep that has gone astray, towards the sheep that is without a shepherd. Encountering Jesus in our lives means that we will never be the same again. The way that we live and love is going to be an evidence of that. Now, this is the story of someone who has arguably been the most impactful Christian writer in the 20th century, or pretty close to it. So two of the biggest writers, just in all things, two of the biggest writers in the 20th century, they were talking late one night. J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of the Lord of the Rings series, and C.S. Lewis, who authored the Chronicles of Narnia, were talking. C.S. Lewis was identified at best as a self-identified agnostic, meaning that he believed that there was some sort of higher power, but he didn't follow that higher power. This was something that was very rare in the 1930s, to have an agnostic, right? But he was an intellectual. They were both professors. And he reluctantly believed in this higher power, but he couldn't identify that as the Christian God. He couldn't come to believe two core tenets of the Christian faith. One, that the resurrection happened, and two, that God became human. And so he took a walk. He took a walk with Tolkien, who was a very devout Catholic. And so on this walk, they started talking about the resurrection. But they started talking about resurrection themes. They talked about myths that came about throughout different ancient cultures, like Norse cultures, Greek cultures, Celtic gods, that contained these myths and these stories about a God coming, dying, sacrificing themselves, and then rising and being resurrected. And C.S. Lewis found that these stories to him were very beautiful and moving. He loved these stories. But the story of Jesus' death and resurrection was unmoving to him because, as he stated, because it was supposed to be real, is what he said. And the question that Tolkien asked was why? Why are those stories so moving to you? Why do you find these mythological stories beautiful, but not the resurrection of Christ beautiful? And so this conversation led deep into the night. Eventually, Tolkien said that those stories were beautiful because they were expressions of the real thing. That it was humanity's attempts at groping towards the truth that they had not yet received. That they were groping towards this truth that would eventually be revealed. Like a world that was preparing themselves to receive the actual story. Like an appetizer before the main course. That when it finally came into the world, and reality through Jesus the Christ, who was born in the region of Palestine, who was God that became human and went to the cross and resurrected on the third person to talk to Lewis